Single-story rural home, Virginia, USA, February 18th, 2009. Dana Scully had let a few days pass by, as her friend Mark suggested, but there had still been no sign of Mulder. Now, as she sat anxiously on the sofa pondering the events she and her work colleague had spent together, Dana became annoyed with herself. It had only meant to be one drink, and then she should have made up some excuse to go home. Instead, she'd let him persuade her to dine with him. Mark had tried to point out that she wasn't taking care of herself and had insisted on buying her a meal with the drink he'd bought her, including an extra bottle of red wine to go with the dinner. After drinking far too much of the stuff, she'd then found herself blurting out just how upset she was that Mulder had ditched her like he used to do way too many times in the past, and that perhaps Mark had been right after all. During that evening in the grill and bar, he'd seemed the only person she could open up to with her problems, so when he'd offered her a shoulder to cry on, she'd accepted, and when he'd leaned in for a kiss, had willingly returned it. However, he wasn't the type of guy who would take full advantage of a lady in distress, so when she'd come to her senses and he'd realised that was as far as the evening was going to progress, he'd given an embarrassed apology and even offered her a lift home. A case of momentary insanity, that's all it had been. Consuming far too much alcohol so she hadn't been able to think clearly, which in turn had allowed her to become more open and vulnerable. Whatever the reasons, Scully still couldn't help feeling guilty, and now she was determined more than ever to put every effort into finding the man she truly loved. Crossing over to the phone, she picked it up and dialed the bureau's switchboard. She felt Special Agent Moseley Drummy owed her one, because after all it was Mulder and she who had assisted him and Special Agent in charge Dakota Whitney with that copycat Frankenstein murder case, so the least he could do was offer some damn assistance. However, when she was finally able to talk to the man, she realised to her dismay that all she was getting was a repeat performance from the last time her partner went missing. "I'm sorry, Dr. Scully, I can't help you," he ended abruptly. "Agent Drummy, will you please just listen?" She tried again in her best authoritative tone. "I explained to you that Mulder was reluctant to assist the FBI on that missing agent case, but I persuaded him to accompany you anyway. All I'm asking—" "Dr. Scully," he said, rudely cutting her off right in the middle of her sentence, "I had nothing to do with asking him to join us on that case. That request came from the board of directors. I was simply the messenger." "Okay," she snapped. "So I'm asking as a friend. Would you please help me find him?" There was a long pause while she waited impatiently for an answer. "May I remind you, I lost a friend, ACAC Dakota Whitney, because she chose to listen to one of Fox Mulder's hunches," he pointed out harshly. Scully couldn't believe what she'd just heard. Oh yes, Whitney and he'd been inseparable, like two peas in a pod. What a load of crap! "And you blame Mulder for her death," she replied, amazed he could even contemplate such a thing. "If you must know, he was terribly upset about her murder." "Dr. Scully, I will refer the matter to someone higher up, and that's all I'm going to say," Drummy said, trying to end the conversation. "Don't bother," she replied angrily. "I'd rather do it myself." With that, she slammed the phone down onto its cradle. Furious by Drummy's complete lack of cooperation, not to mention pig-headedness, Dana decided she was going to dial her ex-boss's phone number. No way was she going to attempt to go through the FBI's switchboard again, not after being made to hold forever and a day the last time. Besides, it was late in the evening, so hopefully Walter Skinner would have left his office by now. If not, then she would leave him an urgent message on his machine. On many occasions he'd been there for both herself and Mulder when they were agents under his authority. He'd also stepped in the last time her partner had done a disappearing act, and she knew if he hadn't, they would most likely never have gotten out of that makeshift experiment lab alive. Wearily she walked over to her partner's study, intending to retrieve the address book from inside one of the desk drawers, as she couldn't remember Skinner's number by heart. As she entered the room, she was once more met with Mulder's wallpaper design. It reminded Dana of the X-Files office they used to frequent, and she knew it had also been his intention to replicate the old haunt. Sighing heavily, she realised that by surrounding himself in all of this paranormal paraphernalia, he was never going to be able to let go of the past. Just then she spied the laptop on the desk and chided herself for not thinking about it before. Maybe if she checked his messages, it might give her a clue as to his whereabouts. After switching it on, then typing in the password, "Trust no one," that he'd given to her in the past. She was relieved to see he hadn't changed it and could still gain access. Unfortunately, checking through the emails gave her no luck whatsoever, and she was just about to turn it off in defeat when Dana thought about the information he'd shown her in the hospital 3 days ago, all about the Bloody Mary legends. After going into My Documents, she found one folder with the initials BM typed underneath. Once opened, this revealed several files copied from different web pages, which on inspection just gave her varied tales related to the myth, all of which Mulder had already explained to her before he vanished. But there was another folder in this file, labelled with the letters SMW. Now rather curious, she clicked on it and a text page popped up.
Oh my god.
The first thing that caught her eye was the title that stood out in bold capitals. "The Slitmouth Woman," she said, puzzled. Scully had to admit she didn't remember Mulder telling her anything about this myth, and began reading the text. The first paragraph revealed it was a Japanese urban legend about a woman called Kuchisaki Onna, whose husband, a samurai warrior, mutilated in a jealous rage, leaving her horribly disfigured and left with a mouth which extended from ear to ear in a horrible permanent smile. She became a vengeful spirit who, after murdering him with his own sword, was driven to seek out his soul through the centuries and repeat her actions. Sometimes she could be found wandering the streets of Japan wearing a surgical mask. Scully shuddered after reading that last sentence. Surgical mask, she said to herself. It couldn't be. Compelled to find out more about this legend before jumping to any conclusions, she continued reading and discovered that these people often wore such masks during the winter to prevent others from catching their germs, so the spirit never stood out in a crowd. Scully started to scroll down the page, then suddenly an artist's design came into view and she gasped. The woman looked to be in her early 30s and was incredibly beautiful, except for the hideous gash across her face where her mouth used to be. Underneath the drawing was a great deal more text, which she knew she couldn't afford to skim through, no matter how far-fetched the whole story seemed at face value. So persevering, she carried on, reading word for word, soaking up all the information that was on display. How this tale was related to the Bloody Mary myth, and the spirit could be found in many types of reflections, which she could travel through, exacting her anger on Asian women of similar appearance, who had the nerve to chant the name 3 times, whilst admiring themselves in their mirrors. Once summoned, she would force them to commit suicide through the power of telekinesis. "Like Carrie at the prom," Scully said, remembering one of her favourite Stephen King novels. She also realised the way these women died was exactly how Mulder had described. More information followed, revealing how this spirit disliked any beautiful woman, and should they come into contact with her, could sometimes feel her cold touch. This was starting to get really creepy, and suddenly she didn't wish to read any more, but knew she had to keep going. However, when she'd finally reached the end of the document, Scully had gone rather pale. Reverting back to the previous folder, it was then she noticed she hadn't read all of the files. So with trembling fingers she opened it, and realised it was a side note Mulder had typed up himself, about another paranormal theory, that if someone is killed in front of a mirror, his or her soul can become trapped in its reflection. Now every scrap of information she'd read about this legend was weaving together, and she didn't like the pattern it was forming in her mind, because it was making her seriously start to think that her new physician's assistant Naomi was somehow connected. The rational part of her wanted to say how ridiculous it was to come to that kind of conclusion, but her imagination was now working on overtime. She couldn't help remembering the incident in the hospital when the woman had seemed afraid to remove the surgical mask after being introduced to her, and how cold her hand had been when she shook it. Also how her fiancé had supposedly committed suicide by cutting his throat, and not forgetting the sister who had perished in front of a mirror. Perhaps Kuchisaki ended up in Naomi's mirror, but why didn't she kill her like she killed the others in those old cases? "Oh my God," she said, as the final piece of this bizarre puzzle snapped into place. What if Mulder is one of the reincarnations of Kuchisaki's husband, who she intends on murdering again? Quickly closing down the computer, Scully rushed back into the living area and, grabbing the phone's receiver, redialed the FBI switchboard. She knew it was going way out on a limb here, but as far as she was concerned right now, reality was going to have to take a back seat, because fear for her partner's life was far more important than being rational. "Please, could you put me through to Agent Moseley Drummy?" she asked the operator. "Tell him it's Dana Scully and it's urgent," she stressed, hoping the man hadn't left the building yet, while at the same time praying he wouldn't choose to ignore her completely this time. A minute or two passed, then she heard his voice on the other end, sounding rather annoyed. So nothing had changed there, then. "Don't tell me. Mulder's been abducted by little green men who are threatening to destroy the world," he sneered. Scully stiffened on hearing his cruel jibe, because he didn't even know how true those words had been regarding Mulder, and how those little green men were still very much intent on accomplishing that goal. "No," she said abruptly. "But I do know where he is now, and I'm going to require your help." "Where?" Drummy asked wearily. To be completely honest, he really couldn't care less what trouble Mulder had gotten himself into, but he had to admit he admired Scully's persistence, so would force himself to listen to what she had to say, for a little while at any rate. "I found some information on his computer." Scully paused for a moment, realizing she couldn't tell this guy anything remotely related to the paranormal, or he would think her completely insane and hang up immediately. The truth was she didn't even know if Mulder was even with her assistant, but her instincts were telling her he was, so she had no choice but to resort to some little white lies and hopefully get Drummy to listen. It was a journal he was keeping about an old case he remembered from his past that was never closed, so he wanted to investigate it. "Now, I don't want to bore you with all the details." "How very thoughtful of you," Drummy said sarcastically, cutting her off. "But," she continued, stressing the word strongly, "it involves this woman who is a key suspect, and it says he was planning to go over to her place and confront her. I think maybe she might have kidnapped him or something," Scully said weakly. This was sounding incredibly lame even to her own ears, but she certainly couldn't tell him this woman was possessed by an evil spirit from Japan now, could she? "You think he's been kidnapped by a woman?" Drummy asked, sounding completely astonished. "Yeah, and I also think his life may be in danger," Scully said impatiently. "So I'm going to need a search warrant and someone with firepower. I haven't had a gun in my possession since I left the FBI. "Let me get this straight," Drummy said, trying to wrap his head around what he'd just heard. "You want me to get the FBI to give you a warrant so you can check to see if Mulder is being held hostage by some female psychopath?" "I know it sounds crazy," Scully admitted, "but will you please just trust me on this?" "It sounds completely insane, Dr. Scully," he stated firmly. "So you're not going to help me?" "I didn't say that." "Then what are you saying?" she asked, frustrated. Moseley Drummy had been drawing his own conclusions during their conversation, and could now determine that Scully was refusing to see the obvious truth right in front of her face. "Dana," he said, and couldn't help sniggering a little, "have you ever even considered the possibility that you might be jumping to these crazy conclusions because you don't want to have to face the fact Mulder could be cheating on you with this mysterious woman? I mean, that to me sounds far more logical." Scully was shocked by his response, and wasn't going to believe any of it, even if it did sound much more plausible than what she'd told him. Unfortunately, he would always see her partner in a bad light, no matter what the truth was, and he also didn't know anything about the slip-mouthed woman. All the paranormal theories about that particular entity, as unbelievable as it sounded, were somehow starting to make sense, and she knew Mulder was seriously wrapped up in it. Despite knowing Drummy would never remotely accept any of this, she did have one more card up her sleeve. "I seem to recall you refusing to help Mulder once before," she said, completely ignoring what he'd just told her. "Because you didn't believe he was in any serious trouble, so you turned your back on him. And if it wasn't for A.D. Skinner and myself, he would have died at the hands of a psychotic homosexual Russian immigrant who wanted to behead him with a fucking axe," she yelled, feeling the sting of tears welling up in her eyes. Drummy was taken aback, as he was sure he hadn't heard her use this expletive before. He also realized the anger in her voice had been mixed with emotion, and suddenly began to feel sorry for her. Why should Dana suffer this way? It wasn't fair. He'd never liked Fox Mulder's arrogant nature, and that attitude of his was probably the reason why this stupid man almost got himself killed. So maybe he should go along with her, just so he could make the woman see sense by proving to her once and for all that her partner was a lying, cheating scumbag. Perhaps then she would give him the benefit of the doubt. "All right, Dana," he said. "I'll see if I can get you the search warrant, and I'll be your personal armed bodyguard just this once." Scully forced herself to utter a small thank you before putting down the phone. Once again Dromey had managed to piss her off with his sarcastic attitude, but at least she'd finally got through to him, and now things were starting to go in the right direction. All she needed now was to find Mulder and rescue him from yet another perilous situation without a hitch. The question was, would she be able to, or would she discover too late that all of her luck had in fact run out?